It works. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome. Welcome to the session and welcome to the month of June. We were just talking about that. I can't believe that it's June and I can't believe they were nearly halfway through 2020. I think I'm still processing 2019 and we are halfway through 2020, which is just crazy, mind-blowing. And welcome to both of my guests, Sandra and Bogdan. Great to see both of you rejoining me after a month of our previous session. So while everyone is just finding us here, while everyone is joining, also welcome to anyone who might be watching us on replay. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being interested in this topic. I think all of us are very excited to go into it, because from where we left it last time, it sort of very naturally and nicely flows into this conversation. So before we start, once again, the comments, the chat section is open. It will be open and monitored throughout the session. Let us know how you're doing. Drop us a hi. Let us know where you're dialing in from. And how are you feeling about it being in June and it being halfway through the year? I mean, I can't comprehend it. But let us know how you're doing. Share any thoughts, any reflections as we go through today's topic, and ask any questions. I mean, you couldn't have a better panel to pick those up. So while you're dropping us a hi and letting us know where you're dialing in from, I'm going to ask the same question to my lovely panelists, my lovely guests today, Sandra and Bogdan. How are you both? Where are you dialing in from? And how are you feeling about being halfway through the year?
Well, I will jump in first. I am loving this time of year because it is summer. I am here in the US, in the Midwest. And for those that don't know me, I am Sandra Upton, founder and chief strategist at DEI with Upton Consulting Group. So I get the privilege of working with organizations all over the world, helping them to move their diversity, equity, and inclusion work forward. But I'm excited and I'm encouraged. Again, it's a beautiful time of year for where I live. So it's gorgeous weather. The flowers are blooming. And I have made a very serious commitment to take my self-care up a whole notch. A couple of notches actually this summer. So really just kind of slowing things down and, just being very intentional, because we all know there's so many sad things happening across the country here in the US, but also just around the globe. So being very careful to protect my mental health and to just slow down and really enjoy my family and those close to me. So life is good. I'm grateful.
That's
That's
beautiful.
always
Thank
great.
you so much for spreading some joy here. Go
Always
on,
great to
Bogdan.
hear important values, and important things. And Sandra, I wish more people would do that, because a lot of people talk about taking care of themselves, but they end up by doing quite the opposite. I always tell people balance is not something you find, balance is something you create. And I'm very glad to hear that you're creating that balance, leading by example. So well done, you. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm joining from Amsterdam, from the Netherlands. Surprisingly enough, we also have great weather, because usually June, you don't know how it's going to be. We had an incredibly warm period already, which is very worrying. As much as people say, oh, it's great to be in a t-shirt, there's a problem there, and we're not going to go into that. It's called climate change. But yeah, it's great, and it's funny, Sandra, because with us it's going to be exactly the opposite. We're starting from next week. Actually, we're starting to travel. We've always been traveling around a lot, but now we start to travel. We have an insane amount of keynotes around Europe, covering a lot of different topics, around HR, neuromarketing, a lot of neuroscience applied in a lot of different topics. And it's like a marathon of traveling, and we're very excited. We're very much looking forward. But if in the US there's a lot of problems, and we know what those problems are here, because we live in a bubble under a bubble. The only problem we have is that there's not enough people handling security and suitcases at the airport, so it's a mess. People need 4 or 5 hours to pass through security check and so on. That's the only problem we have in this country. That and a little bit of inflation. Which, of course, for us here is like the worst thing that has ever happened in this country. But it's a little bit of a luxury problem, because, again, we live in a bubble, inside a bubble, inside a bubble, inside a bubble. And I wish everyone would have these luxurious problems that we have and complain about. That's kind of it. But yeah.
Thank you for that. And it really resonates. Funny enough, I went online today this morning on the news. There was an article and a video about Lisbon airport in Portugal, where it's absolutely packed with people. So what you're going to do, European summers, right? And I think people are itching to get out after, very intense couple of years anyway. But welcome,
and
both. Welcome,
everyone wants to
Sandra.
leave at the same time, right? That's the whole thing, that everyone wants to leave at once. And of course, it's just a bottleneck that nobody will be able to solve for the next few months. So
first sunrise out, all of us are out as well. Well, you know my face already, everyone, and I am joining from this, I want to say sunny Uruguay. It's always sunny here. We're actually going into autumn right now, so it's quite chilly compared to what we had going on here in the summer. And I was saying to Sandra this morning that I actually woke up this morning and I thought, I can't believe it's November. And then I realized it's definitely not November, but it feels like it out here. And I'm going back to Europe next week as well. So I'm looking forward to the European summers as well for a while. And I just want to acknowledge everyone who's here. Thank you once again for being here. Hi, Indrajit from India. Hi, Akiri from Nigeria. Derek from Atlanta. And everyone else who is joining us here today. Once again, drop us a hi, drop us any thoughts, any reflections that might come up during this conversation, as we would love to engage with you. This is a hot topic for sure, and we would love to hear, where are you at when the topic of psychological safety comes up. So, we met last month. We met about last time we got together was about a month ago in the same format, and we talked about the future of leadership. What does leading into the future looks and feels like. And if any of you haven't seen this session, there's a replay available on my LinkedIn profile, and I highly encourage you to rewatch that. And though we were talking about leadership, we touched on psychological safety, and I think today we can't talk about workplace cultures or diversity inclusion or leadership for that sake without touching on psychological safety. And so in today's world, also, just having a look at my own LinkedIn feed, I do see a lot of posts coming up mentioning psychological safety. So clearly it is a hot topic these days, and so we felt that it was important to give this topic the airtime it deserves. And so here we are. And so during this session of operationalizing psychological safety, what we're going to do is touch very briefly on ultimately what is psychological safety. So just again, we can set the scene from which we're going to be having this conversation. Why is it important? Why is it important to talk about? And more importantly, why is it important to create it? And lastly, how do we create it? And how do we know that our employees and our colleagues are feeling safe? So why don't we go right in there, and what is psychological safety, and what is meant by psychological safety when we use that in the context of workplaces. And I'm very curious of both of your views, Sandra, from sort of DEI point of view, and sort of Bogdan also adding some sort of neuroscience aspect to that as well. Would absolutely love to hear from you. And whoever wants to kick first, Sandra, would you like to go?
Probably should unmute first, but sure. So I am just delighted to be a part of this conversation, because I do agree with you. It is a hot topic. And the reason it's, I think, such a hot topic is because none of us has fully figured out everything, right? And I think we're all still on this journey to really understand what it means and what it looks like. And there are different dynamics in different organizations, but I think it is important to talk through it today. And I think we'll be able to share a few ideas around ways in which we can continue to move things forward. But the way I think about psychological safety is this idea of, and I'm thinking about it within the context, of course, of an organization. So it's when employees feel comfortable sharing ideas, their thoughts, their perspectives, they're comfortable challenging the status quo, and they're even comfortable or feel safe failing without negative consequences. right? And I think that's the caveat. So they're comfortable, again, showing up as who they are, and not having to give up as they're sharing their ideas, and as they're challenging the status quo, and as they are, even in some instances, failing. They're comfortable doing that, knowing, again, that there are no consequences, but also they understand, and they feel as though they are not having to give up their cultural identity or their cultural values. So I think those are the two key dynamics. Can I truly bring my whole self and engage in a way where I'm not having to leave who I really am, my cultural identity, my cultural background at the door?
I love that, Sandra, because, when we talk about psychological safety and about, no negative consequences, we're not saying that psychological safety eliminates accountability. It
Right.
just says that we can show up with our full identity or layers of identity, our cultural identity, and and it will be accepted, it will be acknowledged, and it will be respected. So yeah, thank you for that view. Bogdan.
Absolutely.
I like what you said, that should not replace accountability, or should not be misunderstood, because unfortunately what I see already more and more is that certain professionals are trying to do exactly that. They try to get rid of accountability, or they try to replace accountability with the feeling of not being psychologically safe. Don't do that. Don't do that. We can see what you're doing. Very simply put, and from a psychological perspective, and as I always say, to explain it to a 5 years old, right? Explain it like I'm 5. Psychological safety, exactly as Sandra was mentioning as well, means feeling safe in my own environment, in the situation, in the workplace. How do I feel safe? Well, and again, Sandra, I echo very much what you said. Failure should be accepted, should be embraced, and even if possible encouraged, because you only learn if you fail, and of course you want to control that failure in a specific way, but feeling that you can fail and that's accepted is very important. Very important as well, speaking up, not being afraid in any way of any consequence because I'm speaking up. Now, of course, if accountability is one derived from it, also the way you speak up is important, because you still have to be respectful and professional. It doesn't mean that because you can speak up and your psychological safety is guaranteed, then you just can just troll, and then because then we go into microaggressions and intersectionality and cognitive biases. So that's also a no. So that's why it's so important. It's like shifting sands, and we need to be careful here. Another thing that I would add, and I think it would be like another an idea to add, maybe two things. Number one is exactly that, ideas. Being encouraged to come up with ideas, no matter how stupid or how crazy or how non convey are. And one thing that for me is very important is conflict. Embracing conflict, but embracing productive conflict, because the moment we stay away from conflict is a bad thing. Conflict is not always a bad thing. Productive conflict is a good thing. A lot of creativity, a lot of innovation comes from this productive conflict, as we call it. But we need to address it. We need to mention how this conflict is being handled, addressed, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different aspects of psychological safety, but I think between the three of us, we kind of covered a lot of these dimensions.
Thank you, Bogdan, and thank you for that additional, layer that you introduced to this conversation. And I think we probably will go into, those. We will unpack that in a little bit more detail as we go through. And so, once again, there is a lot of conversation going around and about psychological safety, especially in the context of, again, diversity and inclusion, belonging, mental well-being. And apart from, psychological safety being the basic human need on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you look at, from that point of view, why is it important to not overlook the importance of psychological safety in a workplace setting?
Yeah, and I'll jump in to that. I think when we overlook it or deny it, ignore it, I think the consequences are multiple, right? You have people, if I don't feel comfortable bringing myself to work, and again, when I say bringing myself to work, I'm talking about thinking about it in terms of my cultural values and my cultural background. So it goes back to even what Bogdan said earlier. It doesn't mean that you can just show up and just think you can behave any kind of way and there not be consequences or there's no accountability. But when we attach it to my core values and my beliefs, then that's a different conversation, and that's something that can be acknowledged. But when we don't create that space, all kinds of negative consequences, we don't get the best out of people. So if I can't bring who I am and again, my ideas and challenge things in a respectful way, and we can talk about how we even define that, right? But if I can't do that, then it's going to shut me down, and I'm not going to feel motivated to share my ideas and share my skills and my talents. And then that's going to have a negative impact on innovation, on creativity, and ultimately the bottom line. So there are, I think, many consequences when we don't create a space where people feel safe. And I think what's really important, and I know we've not gotten into the how quite yet, but I think it's so important as just a foundational part of the conversation when we talk about creating a psychologically safe space. It requires leadership in the organization to change their mindset in terms of how they think about this conversation, because I think at its core, if we're going to have honest and authentic conversation around this, we have to step back and say, okay, in order to create a psychologically safe space, we have to say, okay, first of all, when we look at the culture of the organization as it is today, who created that culture, right? And who was the culture created for? And oftentimes in most organizations, that culture was created by the dominant group, and it was designed to support the dominant group, right? And now we know we have diversity. We've always had diversity, but even more so than ever. And so does that culture really support and embrace the diversity that's now represented in the organization? And that's where the tension arises. So I think it's so important we have to, in order to even have, again, substantive conversation around this, we've got to go back to the fundamental question of asking, who made the rules in the first place, right? And who are those rules designed to benefit? And if we can't acknowledge that they were designed for the dominant group and acknowledge that they ultimately benefit the dominant group, we're not going to be able to make a whole lot of progress in terms of action if we don't first acknowledge that fact. And I think about my children. I have two children. They're adult children right now, but I think about my daughter, who is the older of the two. When she was little, she used to she never liked to wear matching clothes, in particular, like her socks. It would be nothing for her to want to walk out the door, go to school, and have one sock that was stripes and another sock that had polka dots. And I remember just challenging her a little bit and saying, what why won't you put on just matching socks or whatever? And I remember, her saying, what does that have to do with me being able to learn at school? And I remember that was just a huge aha moment for me as a mom, this child helping me see right away that, she just wanted to be free and go to school. And it was fun for her to just kind of put on what she wanted to put on. It had absolutely zero to do with her ability to perform at school. And so when I think about that example, and I share it often because I think that's the same in terms of organizations. When we don't allow people to be who they are and come into the workplace, again, we miss out, and we ignore the fact that oftentimes, when we limit people, it has oftentimes for reasons that have zero to do with their ability to actually do their job. So I think that's a really important point. But that foundation, I think, is really critical to the conversation.
You're describing microaggressions, Sandra, and it's very spot on, because we were running a massive conference with a very important bank a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about the concept of microaggressions, and people started to ask what these microaggressions are, and the way they would describe microaggressions was a microaggression itself. Because I remember someone saying, oh, microaggression is like when someone is rolling their eyes and the other person makes too much of a deal out of it. We're like, there you go. That one is called bullying on top of a microaggression. And if this is the way we address these things, and this is the way we endorse them and we address them, then the person will feel psychologically unsafe. And it's very interesting because, Baiba, what you asked is very simple. Why? Well, let's look at it from a neurochemical perspective. If I'm stressed, the moment I'm stressed, we go into something that we call the fight or flight response, which normally it is happening at freeze, flight, fight, sometimes fawn mechanism. But again, we're not going to go too much into that. But when the freeze or flight response happens, three fundamental neurotransmitters are being automatically produced in our bodies. Now, I'm not going to go too much into it, but I'm going to focus on adrenaline, cortisol, and noradrenaline. Adrenaline is the one that help us run away or anything like that. Noradrenaline, that not a lot of people know of, is something that gives us the motivation or give us that extra push, jump over the fence when the animal is attacking or anything like that. And then there's the cortisol, which everyone calls all the time the stress syndrome, the stress hormone, which in all fairness sounds super negative because cortisol is actually very positive for us as well. But there are some important things there. When we go into this fight or flight response as a result of feeling unsafe psychologically or physically, and this also applies in the workplace, what happens is that the noradrenaline, if there's too much of this noradrenaline or motivation or excitement, what happens is that it turns into fear. It turns into it has a negative effect. So we need to understand that a lot of people say, oh, no, noradrenaline is great. Up to a certain point, too much of it will actually have a really negative effect. But what is important there is the cortisol as well, because higher or increased amounts of cortisol have a direct impact on cognition. High levels of cortisol for a very long time are decreasing cognition. So I think it's A plus B is C. Do you want your employees to have high productivity? Do you want your employees to be creative? Then stop stressing them out. Because if you stress them out and they feel psychologically unsafe, what will happen is that you decrease the very cognition that you need for them to be productive. Choice is yours. And we go very often in C-level meetings, and we say exactly this, because people try to turn it around, and we're saying, look, this is how the human brain works. This is how the human body works. This is how your adrenals are working. This is what happens with cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. And we're not going to go into oxytocin bonding. We're not going to go into dopamine and different motivation pathways, but it's very simple. What do you want for your human capital to do? You want them to be super productive? Then stop stressing them. And there's always like this aha moment from people. It's like we invented the wheel and we reinvented the human brain. No, we did not. Provide that supportive, working, warming, welcoming environment for your employees, and everybody will thrive.
Yeah, I love that, and I just wanted to piggyback, if you're okay with it.
Please.
I would almost even go a step further and say not only does it stress your employees out, but it creates trauma, right? That's very real, trauma. And we
Mental
know
health.
that when we look at the research, all of us have the potential, when we talk about the consequences of an employee not feeling psychologically safe, they do things like cover, or they feel forced to assimilate, and all of those things, again, create stress. They create trauma. And we know that's even magnified more when we look at underrepresented employees, or those employees who have been historically excluded. So it's a whole nother level of stress and trauma, because again, who made the rules in the first place? Who set the culture in the first place? It's that dominant culture. So I think while we need to pay attention to everybody if we're trying to create an inclusive environment and create a psychologically safe place, but we have to understand that there are different layers of this. Even when we think about the different employees and those that are underrepresented, that there may be some different strategies, greater acknowledgement and some different strategies to address that, because that trauma is even a bit deeper for those groups.
And it's good that you mentioned this, Sandra, because what is very interesting. Then, we're going deeper, right? If we're going into diversity, then we're going into cultural specifics, right? Culture specifics. And depending on where you are, in which culture you have been raised, then the way you respond to trauma and the way you showcase or signal the fact that you have trauma or that you're experiencing traumatic experiences is totally different. In certain cultures, people will immediately speak up and they'll say, I don't feel good, I need to talk to a psychologist. But then you also have cultures who will not speak about this, and that trauma will develop and it will be worse and worse. Oh, but why do you know anything? Because he or she or they or them never mentioned anything about it. No, because they're coming from a culture where you don't talk about this. You come from a culture where you don't openly speak speak about your psychological state of being. It's a taboo still in many cultures. In many cultures, going to a psychologist doesn't happen because automatically people assume that you are crazy. So as a result, when people don't even address this, how do you want, how do you want, oh yeah, but if nobody addresses it, then everything is fine. That is bad leadership.
Thank you both for those contributions. And what stuck with me, well, first and foremost, what stuck with me is that, Sandra, your daughter was trendy with the mismatching socks before mismatching socks became trendy. And I also loved, how she quickly came back with what does this have to do with my performance in this environment? And this is coming from a child, yet the answer is still the same in the work environment. And I feel that sometimes when we have these, big terms, psychological safety, inclusion, belonging, we often overcomplicate them. We often overcomplicate them. We often feel like we need 12-month or 18-month strategies for them. And yet there is a time and place for strategies, but there is a lot of in this that can be done, and it doesn't require strategy. It can be done today. And so, some of the things that you already mentioned is, just taking it back to absolute business basics. It in psychological safety enhances employee engagement. That is very directly tied to business critical success factors, be it growth, be it performance, be it productivity, be it revenue, whatever it is. And in most basic business terms, employee turnover, if we talk about employee engagement, costs businesses billions. It costs businesses billions every year. Let's talk about employee well-being. Again, it's directly tied to business success factors. Again, let's talk about the most basic terms of sick days, lost productivity, and again, how much that costs to business. And you both already mentioned, the power that psychological safety gives to enhance creativity, productivity, innovation. Again, all very much tied to success and sustainability of a business long term. And every business, today talks about innovation, yet there can't be no, real sustainable long-term innovation without psychological safety. And, and as I said before, psychological safety is at the very bottom, at the very foundation of the, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm just, using that as an example because I do know that most people are familiar with what I mean by that. And so,
And it's
please.
I'm just something that came into my head because I'm literally reliving a conversation that I had a week ago during a conference with someone who was talking about well-being. And what they said, although a little bit extreme, I do agree between the lines. And what they said was, what happens if you talk about well-being in a lot of organizations, then the solution that people in the decision making part of whatever they want to address, they will always say, oh, let's just bring someone to do yoga. Oh, is there a problem with well-being? Let's just bring someone to do some yoga. Let's just bring someone to do mindfulness. If we think that well-being is being fixed with a session of yoga or with someone doing mindfulness, we have a severe problem in front of us. And the reason for that is unfortunately, and that's what that person was mentioning, and I can understand that, somehow, right? I mean, human beings associate. And in the last period, we started to have these associations, whereas well-being or personal well-being automatically will be solved with mindfulness or with Mindspace app or anything like that. So if that works on an individual level, that probably works on a cultural level, on the entire culture, the entire ecosystem. Let's just bring someone to close their eyes and, breathe 4 times, and then all the problems will go away. We need to understand that well-being has a lot of different ramifications, and we need to understand the psychology behind it. We need to understand the anthropology behind it. We need to understand the behavior behind it. We need to understand the cultural background. We need to understand everything from a DEI perspective and how each person, represented or underrepresented, is experiencing it. We need to understand microaggressions, and then we can talk well-being. You do not fix well-being the same way as you do not fix DEI by bringing someone for an hour and talk about it and say, well, that's great, that covered our budget, what is next? We need to step away from this type of actions and responses. They're not even responses, they are reactions, if anything.
And you absolutely summed it up. And again, talking about the lack of psychological safety, it introduces stress. Prolonged stress creates trauma. And we cannot heal 10, 20, a lifetime worth of workplace trauma with a cup of Starbucks or a spa day or a yoga session. All of those things have got its time and place, and they
If
are great and
anything,
they are
Baiba,
enjoyable.
if anything, what we do with it is by giving those mindfulness sessions and a the 3 cups of Starbucks, we prolong that a period of trauma, and we create situations from which the brain will need months or years to recover. We talk here about post-traumatic. We talk about burnouts, right and left, burnouts, because what we do, we don't let people collapse. We actually give them a little bit of a candy here and there, and we stretch them out even more. So as a result, when they will collapse eventually, because they will collapse way worse. Anything, not only that they're not fixing anything, they're trying to create, a storm in a bucket, to put it very visually. But actually, they have an even longer negative effect on the well-being of their colleagues and employees.
Absolutely. And it also minimizes the whole, because we only talk about the positives, but it minimizes the trauma, the workplace trauma that people are exposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, I know, as we start thinking about, what can we do, how do we actually operationalize a psychological safety? I go back to what I said a few moments ago. The first step is the acknowledgement piece, right? Acknowledging, right? There's a history here, right? How do we get here, right? We got here because we created a culture that was, again, designed by the dominant culture group and has really benefited the dominant culture group. So if we don't acknowledge that, again, we're going to be limited in terms of our effectiveness in trying to address the problem, whether it's a Starbucks cup of coffee or, a yoga or whatever else we think we try to do to sort of put the band. So there has to be that acknowledgement. And again, that's where that mindset shift has to happen. And then once we acknowledge it, then we can have some real conversations, right? So when I say acknowledge, I'm talking about leadership in the organization. So we've got leaders that are listening in on this conversation today. That's your first step, right? And we talk about what do we do and how do we think about operationalizing this? Let's be honest about how we got here, right? Why is this even an issue? Why are we having the conversation? It's because historically, it's how things were designed. And now we're dealing with the consequences. And now we're trying to turn the tables because we understand, at least in theory, that DEI is important and benefits all organizations. But now we got to do the work, right? We've got to create that inclusive environment that we claim to want. And a big part of that is creating that psychological safety. So that acknowledgement of the truth and of the history and what has gotten us here is incredibly important. And then I think there's some other steps, but I don't want to jump ahead of the questions that you might have for us. So,
well, Sandra, I will jump there a little bit because I very much like what you say, and I think that, in my opinion, that should come with something almost immediate, which is not only understand and acknowledge, but make it an explicit priority.
Absolutely.
This needs to be made. This is not. This is once you acknowledge and you talk about and you understand where it's coming from, you need to make it an explicit priority inside your organization, and you need to make it an explicit priority yesterday. And then, of course, there's a lot of tools how to go forward, and how you apply it, and it. But you need first and foremost to make it a priority, not only in terms of the people you allocate or the resources you allocate, but especially of the financial resources you allocate to, to fixing it, or at least addressing it, and so on and so forth. Because again, we go into a situation which is, again, budget. How can we paint this? By making it look different, although the only thing we do is we paint the same hat. Making it a explicit priority means also allocating the human capital and the financial resources to keep on developing psychological safety inside the organization.
And thank you both for already leading us into this piece. And it is very important to talk about. And so let's talk about it. And but before we do, I just want to anyone who is with us here on live, let us know, how can you tell, what are the signs that you know an organization is practicing psychological safety? How do you know? What are the signs? What are the gut feels it might be? Let us know. I'm very, very curious about it, and we'll pick those up in just a moment. But as we talked about, we've talked about what is psychological safety. You've both established a very compelling case to why it is important. So let's get into how. From my work as a DEI strategist and leadership coach, I find that organizations and leaders more or less grasp the diversity piece because it's relatively tangible. And we see that through the organizations overwhelmingly focusing on addressing the social identity numbers in their organization above everything else. When it comes to such topics as inclusion, belonging, psychological safety, and even workplace culture as such, I find that organizations and leaders don't fully grasp them. They are still mostly abstract and elusive terms and notions to them, and they struggle to translating them into business terms, the growth, productivity, revenue, whatever it might be. And the interesting thing is that all of these things are directly tied to those business success factors. So, for instance, there are many resources available that advise organizations and leaders to be more empathetic, to be more open, to exercise active listening. But this is the same advice we have been giving leaders since 1990s, when the topic of emotional intelligence entered the business world. And here is a fun fact for the listeners. Actually, the topic of psychological safety, or the term of psychological safety, entered the business world at the same time as emotional intelligence. Yet we have not given it half as much of airtime and attention that we have emotional intelligence. And there are industries and businesses built solely around emotional intelligence. And so many of those people who populated the business world, back then in the 90s when these terms entered, they're still around. And they're not just still around, they are now in leadership and decision-making spaces. And we're still giving the same advice and yet seeing very little progress. So I understand why perhaps they might think, well, it didn't work back then 30 years ago. Why should I, be investing into it today? Mm-hmm. So with all, this in mind, and before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty how, I'm curious, and Sandra already touched on it, how do you approach the psychological safety conversation when working with clients? How do you usually begin? How do you get their buy-in when they already from the get-go might be skeptical?
Oh, that's a great question, and that can be done a couple of different ways, but typically, I might come in and I may challenge them to just do an assessment, right, of their current state in terms of how employees, because they're the ones that really can tell you what's going on. So to do some assessment to get some sense of how employees are perceiving, right, this commitment to inclusion and ultimately this psychologically safe environment. And so if they've not done any kind of assessment in that way, or reached out and done some kind of survey, I usually will strongly encourage that they do that, because I want to hear from employees in terms of how they are feeling. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, we know that, again, those who are underrepresented or those who have been historically excluded, they oftentimes have not had a voice. And so I really want to find out how they are feeling about the culture and whether or not it's psychologically safe. And then you asked about this idea of, what are the signs that we are actually making some progress and that we have attempted to create this psychologically safe space. I think one of the biggest signs is that you have leaders who are truly, we talk about active listening, but they really are listening and they're asking questions. Right. So if I go in and I see that the leaders, all the way from the top to middle managers, they're asking questions of their employees and of their team members. They're asking questions like, what's one thing you need from me in order to be successful in your work? What's one thing I'm doing that actually is hindering your success in your work? What things that are part of our systems and our policies and our routines do you feel are hindering? So they are asking, intentionally and consistently asking questions of their team members, and they're doing that in a lot of different ways. Those could be one-on-one conversations with their team members. It could be through town hall meetings that the top leadership is holding with the organization. It could be through surveys, but they are consistently asking questions to get feedback from employees about how they are perceiving the organization in terms of its commitment to psychological safety, and giving feedback around how they feel. So I think that's a big piece. So if I see you asking questions, and then part of that process also, again, another sign is that they are intentional about equipping their leaders to be able to facilitate those conversations. Right? Because we know that they're not all experts. They're not, they're not counselors. They're not psychiatrists. They're not DEI experts. And so they do need to be equipped with the skills and ultimately the confidence to be able to have these discussions. So when I see that not only are they asking questions, but they're working hard to make sure leaders have the capability, the skills, again, the confidence to be able to facilitate these conversations, that's another very positive sign that they're moving in a good direction. And then I think another very positive sign is that when you look at the data in the organization, you don't see a lot of gaps from an equity perspective, right? Because that's a clear sign that it's not safe when you see a lot of gaps from an equity perspective. But when you see those gaps being closed, and what I mean by gaps, I mean, when you look at leadership, is it representative of the diverse population of employees that are part of the organization, or do you see gaps there? When you start to look at things like compensation, are certain groups being paid more than other groups, even though they're doing the same job? When you see those gaps, those are clear signs. Those equity gaps, they're clear signs again that it's not quite safe. But when you see those gaps close, because that's one of the positive consequences of creating a safe space, because now everybody is comfortable, everybody's feeling like they can thrive, and they're giving their best, and so they all should be experiencing equitable opportunities. So those are a few things that I think are some of the signs. And then those systems and policies and routines and practices are supporting the work versus undermining the work versus serving as a barrier to the work. So I think those kinds of things I look for that can tell me whether or not the organization is really serious about creating a psychologically safe space, and they're really moving in the direction to do so.
Thank you, Sandra. Do you have anything to build upon that, Bogdan?
Well, I listen to understand and then to reply. So of course I'm listening to everything that Sandra is saying, and I'm taking in because it's very insightful. And that's one of the reasons I love to be part of such conversations, because I'm here not only to share my knowledge, but to learn from others. So usually when there's a long pause, it means that as a human being, I'm really taking in what I'm hearing. So for those who pretend to listen, if you really listen to the person before you, normally there should be a pause. Otherwise, you don't really listen. People come to us.
Active listening in practice right now. This was
this is active listening. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. You can't say and then continue, because that's not really. That doesn't mean that you actually listen to understand. It takes a while for the brain to process the information until something comes out of it. Anyway, that's a different story. Normally, people come to us because they need something. We never go to people. We never do business development. We don't go to companies, say, hey, maybe you need this, because we have no ideas what they need, and we don't want to waste our time by guessing or assuming. So usually organizations or decision makers come to us, and usually they come to us for three very simple things. Number one is because they want to enhance the development or growth of their talent, of their employees. That can be engagement, that can be activation, or that can be generally learning and development. They come to us because something's up, and they can feel or they can sense that something's up, but they don't know how to address it, and they don't know what is up. Or they come to us because there's a severe red flag, right? The ones with the red flags are usually the most difficult to convince, funny enough, right? Because they don't necessarily come to us from their own free will. They come to us because everything's about to collapse. Funny enough, those are the ones who are always most reluctant to things. And we always say, why do you come to us if you're trying to be so reluctant? Anyway, and then as a result, our conversations are a little bit different, because usually people are in a state of mind and in a psychological state where you can actually have conversations and bounce ideas and so on. But what is very interesting is that most of them, they always ask about measurement, right? If we cannot measure it, if we cannot measure impact, if we cannot measure results, then how can I give you a budget, and so on. And every single time I hear this measurement, I always remember one of my favorite quotes, and I love to use it. I used it earlier today as well. Not everything that can be measured counts, and not everything that counts can be measured. And I'll say that again, and I'll twist it again. Not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured actually counts. And especially when it comes to human capital and so on, you cannot expect me to sit down with you, create a strategy, do a couple of trainings, workshops, conversations with people, learning and understanding what is going on. And then you're expecting that in the week after, everyone will be holding hands and singing Kumbaya, because now we addressed and we fixed everything. We fixed the eye, we just fixed everything within a week. And this is always a very interesting thing into how we bring these elements. Well, first of all, you make it a priority. Second of all, you talk about conflict. I was mentioning that earlier. Open the room and have conflict debates, allow people to come with conflictual situations, of course, moderate them properly and so on, but allow for that productive conflict to come in. Support everyone's ideas, no matter how crazy those ideas are. Allow for people to come with those ideas and listen to those ideas and try to do something with them. Then failure, because we spoke a lot about failure. In a lot of different cultures, failure is a complete taboo. If as a child I have never been allowed to fail, how am I going to deal with failure inside an organization? There's procrastination, there's failure, there's time management, there's a lot of things that every person has. How do you address failure in an organization? Let's set some clear rules about failure, how it's being handled, and how and how we address it, how we even make sure that everyone understands it in the same way. Everyone speaking up. How do we facilitate everyone speaking up? Do these things. We should always start with that. Start with listening, start with understanding, start with the moment you ask people to give you their feedback, especially if it's about psychological safety, you will get some fists in your face. If you're not prepared for that, don't pretend, because you cannot talk about a topic which is so primal as psychological safety, and you expect that people will come and hug. They will hug at the end, but before that happens, you will have to go through before you get to the scar, there's an open wound and there's a lot of pus. And I'm going to make it again very visual, because I love to do that. If you stick your finger in the wound, be prepared that there's going to be some pus on your finger. But there's the only way you can cauterize, and you can come with a very nice scar that you can talk about afterwards. So very often people come to us and say, how can we do it that it also looks pretty? Well, I'm sorry, but it's not pretty. The reason you came here is because it's not pretty. So let's just not try to make it pretty. Let's address it. Let's talk about it. Let's take everything in. Let's come up with a strategy, and let's move on. Let's move further. But just like the process of change or any metamorphosis, the middle part is messy. It's dirty. And it is what it is. So if you're not ready for that, then, just go and paint your hat, and please don't contact us.
I love that. I love the very visual metaphors that you use. I'll have to process them after this conversation, but but I just want, and then we've got some really amazing questions coming in, and I really want to pick those up. And so before I do that, I just want to replay and just echo once again what both of you have just said about what does it mean to operationalize psychological safety. So you've talked, in one way or another, you've talked about establishing norms. What do leaders do? What do they not do? Be it speaking up, be it not saying anything. What are their behaviors and actions? And that's why we say, actions speak louder than words, right? What are the behaviors that are being modeled? We've talked about about coaching, basic behaviors, basic behavior change. Then my question would be, how many of your leaders regularly receive individual and team coaching? And not just a one-off or a 6-week program, but really on continuous basis. Continuing the training, organizational L&D, learning and development. Who has access to it? Who has access to this kind of training? Do you have to reach a certain point in your organization, certain title before you get access to this training? Or is everyone encouraged to go through this training, leadership training, coaching, whatever it might be? The feedback process, we talked about communications, the feedback process, what is the feedback process in your organization? Is it encouraged? Is it rewarded? Is it punished? What is the flow of it? Is it only top down? Only the leaders can give feedback? Or is it both ways? Is it sideways? Is it given once a year during annual reviews and someone, picks up an example, from January 2021 and now they want to talk about it? Or is it fluid and is it ongoing? Is it agile? In general, what behaviors have been rewarded and what's been, punished? I have been in organizations where one of the organizational values is courage, yet speaking up is not encouraged and it's actually punished. And I don't mean, public execution. You don't get projects, you don't get that bonus, you get excluded. That's what we are talking about. How is vulnerability and storytelling encouraged? Who asks the questions? And, talking about questions, you both have mentioned that. And who's supposed to know it all? And again, there are certain things that do not require a 12-month strategy and a steer of approval to do. These things can be done today. They can be started today. And with all that, I just want to bring in a couple of questions that have been brought in. And Bianca asks a question. So the dominant group plays a huge role in shifting the attitude in organization. Absolutely. So do you have any best practices in educating the dominant group to improve psychological safety from anyone?
Yeah, I think part of what they can do, one strategy is, again, for them to do, whether you want to call it a listening tour or a town hall, but to take time to listen to their employees, and in particular, those employees that are underrepresented. I think for them to hear their feedback and their stories about how they feel when they show up to work, I think can be really powerful. So I think that's one strategy, is to just take some time to listen. And again, that can happen in a lot of different ways. And I think another thing that you can put in front of the group of leaders is data. Right? What is the data telling you? So if we truly have created a psychologically safe space here and all of our employees are thriving, that should be reflected in the data. And again, data meaning in terms of who's in leadership, is that diverse? Who is everybody getting equitable opportunities to be promoted? Are people being compensated fairly? So I think to go to leaders and again, challenge them to take the time to listen, and do it in a formal way, again, whether that's through some big town hall meeting or just having some one-on-one discussions, but really listening to the experiences of their employees and how they perceive it, and then looking at what the data says. And I think those are two baseline steps that you can take that then should inform a more customized or contextualized strategy for how to keep moving the organization forward in terms of creating a psychologically safe space.
And Sandra, we do again very much agreeing there. We do we do a couple of things, and that very much again depending on the budget and how much organizations want to invest into specific things. One of the simplest things that we do is what we call kugotla. Kugotla is something that happens in South African villages. So really in the South Africa, I think it's Sotho and Tswana, if I remember. They have the oldest democracy. Even before Democratis was invented by the Greeks, there was the oldest democracy that has been ever established in history and humanity. It's still up to date in these villages. All the villagers come together and they create a circle. Everyone is in the circle, everyone is facing each other, and everyone is entitled to talk. The person will come in front, will talk, everyone will listen, everyone will go back. But everyone will see everyone. That's important, because very often what we see in these organizations is that we start to separate or split the teams. We put the dominant part in a different part, and we still kind of segregate. We don't want to segregate. We want for everyone to be in a circle. Everyone's equal. Everyone has a saying to begin with. Second of all, another thing that we can do, but that's a little bit more costly, is we can actually analyze facial gestures and microaggressions. We have very strong, powerful cameras that can do that in real time with a lot of people. And we can actually analyze microaggressions and facial gestures to look into responses and reactions in terms of primary emotions on people's faces. And very often here is where I hear a lot of people working in, especially neuroscientists coming now, neuromarketing. Oh, we read the emotions on the faces. No, you cannot read emotions on people's faces. And for those who do not believe it, please, I can send a million a book and research about that. We do not read emotions. We can read primary emotions, but we don't know what actually people think based on their facial gestures. Plus, that if we are to talk about Western cultures, everyone over the age of 35 has half of the face paralyzed because of Botox and fillers. So please stop with we know we read facial gestures and we know what they think, because it doesn't work like that. Anyway, I'll put it there because again, we've done a lot of this. But we analyze facial gestures primarily to look at their primary responses before they fake it. Is what that limbic system tells us. And then according to that, we address then specifically and behind closed doors, different people, how they addressed. Not necessarily to say, hey, you reacted like this, but to say, were you aware of the fact that you had this reaction? Because most people are not even aware of that. And unfortunately, one of the things that we see where things go wrong is when we talk about psychological safety, or we create this accountability or whatever, we automatically attack the person based on something that we saw about them, but we don't first and foremost ask, were you aware that you're doing that? Right? And that is a microaggression in itself, the moment we already cast judgment on a person without even asking the person if they were aware, genuinely aware, if that is happening. And then we build on that. So there's a lot of tools. Some of them are extremely simple. A lot of them are extremely cheap. Because, as always, people say, how much and can you measure it? How much and can you measure it? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to bring a team of 800 people to address psychological safety. And Bye, you were saying it, and Sandra, you were saying it as well. You don't need 8 million years or light years in terms of speed and time for that to happen. The only thing that is needed is for you to want it, to make it a priority, and to really be serious about it. Start from there.
I love that. And, and the question that you asked, were you aware of it? That's a classic, when we talk about, self-awareness, those are classic coaching questions. And so, if we say, how can you educate the dominant group, whatever dominant group in this context is, and if we talk leaders specifically, I would be looking at, are they receiving continuous coaching? Because if the only training your leaders receive is a one-off keynote speech on their away day once a year, that's not it. And we already talked about it last month when we got together and we talked about leadership. Leadership is a fluid, moving, growing, evolving activity and notion. So we also have to be agile and keep on developing our skills. And it all begins with raising self-awareness. Shanice is asking there's a lot of fantastic questions, and I'm going to pick a few of those because I think they're absolutely brilliant. Shanice is asking, how do you keep employees engaged when they have provided the data, asked to provide additional data, and changes are not happening?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I was looking at that question, and I think, to me, part of the answer is, it goes back to really questioning how serious leadership is, right? So if you are giving them data, and I'm talking about both, qualitative and quantitative. So if people have spoken up, if employees have spoken up and said, I don't feel comfortable here, I don't feel safe, I don't feel valued, I don't feel seen, and they're hearing that through stories and experiences. And then on top of that, you're giving them data, again, data that's showing that there are all kinds of inequities in the organization. And they have all of that, and they still are asking for more data. I would push back and say, okay, what else do you need and why? Right. And if they don't have a good answer for that, then it almost gets to a point where you have to question how serious they are. Right. And is it the best place for you? Because, you may not necessarily feel like you can fully show up and that you are fully seen there. So I would flip it, and I'd flip the question back to them and say, we've given you all of this data. Why is it not enough? What else do you need in order to begin to create some change? And if they don't have good answers or good responses to that, then again, I would really begin to reevaluate whether or not they are very serious about the work.
We did a why session, Sandra, 2 weeks ago. Same thing where nothing was moving, and we did exactly the same thing. We went back, and generally, it's very annoying to just ask why to a person because they become defensive and so on. And we said we're going to do an exercise, and it might be annoying, but do you actually want to get to the bottom of this or not? So we did something which in behavioral cognitive therapy sometimes you should not do because you can put your patient in a very stressful situation. But this was not the case. And I'm known to be quite unorthodox when we want results and the people ask for it. So I just ask why. But why don't you do it? Because blah, 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 blah. But why? Well, because blah, blah, blah. What? So after, I think, 30 minutes of why, as we say in the Netherlands, there comes the question. And next to ego, there was also a big challenge around stakeholder management. Let's put it like that. Or, certain stakeholders had different desires in how those things. Important, very important. There were different learning and development structures at place externally that should have been addressed there. So we go into all this thing, and why always works. Why? Something is going on there.
No, I totally agree with it. And I know that we have gone over time, but do you both have 5 more minutes just to pick up 2 more questions that we have in the chat?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And whoever can still stay with us, thank you so much. So Troy is asking an interesting question here. I have been told that some of these concepts are very Western centric. What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. And I think that we've been quite intentional. I mean, when you look at just our panel or however you want to describe us, we're very global. I'm the only one on this in this conversation that's here in the US, right? My colleagues are from other parts of the world. So just that alone, I think we've been able to come at this from a global perspective. And I would argue that a lot of the strategies that we've talked about are applicable anywhere in the world. I think, again, you always have to contextualize it and consider the cultural dynamics and differences. So any strategy, when we talk about things from, asking your employees and getting feedback, right? You want to do that through the lens of cultural intelligence, right? So if you know that you are with a cultural group that is not going to be very vocal because of fear of, again, they don't feel safe, or in their culture, it's a very high power distance culture. And so they would never speak out boldly. Then you find different ways to get that feedback, right? Having them speak out is just one way, but you might, again, do a survey, or it may be a one-on-one conversation, or, again, if it's a survey, maybe it's a confidential or one that's anonymous. So you find different ways to get that feedback, given the cultural values and differences that are represented on the team. So again, I would say that everything we've talked about, from getting feedback, from looking at your policies and practices, to really being honest about the history in the past, all of those things I think are appropriate for any environment outside of the Western culture, but you want to be thoughtful and intentional about understanding the cultural dynamics that may be at play when you're having those exchanges.
And maybe, Sandra, it's very good to really emphasize on that. If someone is making a decision in terms of bringing some external experts or external expertise, make sure that they adapt to your culture, not that you adapt to their curriculum, because this is happening very often. Someone who actually really cares about a multicultural environment will never come with their little bag of examples or of other success stories and say, we worked with this and this and this, because that's totally irrelevant. A person who actually really knows what they're talking about will come and will ask questions for the first 2 hours to try to understand your multicultural background, and to try to understand your employees, and to try to understand what the challenges are there. And then they will actually form and format something that works for you. They will tailor something for you. Very important. I always run away from people who give me preset packages. I'm like, great, but you have no idea who I am. Okay, disconnect from LinkedIn. So it is very important there. But that's why what Sandra, what you're saying totally makes sense. Yes, maybe concepts are Western centric, but actually the solutions are not in any way Western centric. They can be very cultural specific if you have the right people at the table. Very important. Make sure who you hire when you hire someone externally.
Thank you for that, Bogdan. And when I look at that question, I want to strip it back even more. And when we talk about the Western centricity, absolutely is there when we look at the media, when we look at social media, where the practitioners are talking about and what the fluffed up versions of this and the trainings look like. Absolutely, it's Western centric. That being said, when we talk about psychological safety, well, actually, before I say that, there are, and you will notice it, look at your family. You will probably find that there are more differences within your family between people and ages and potentially ethnicities and all of those kinds of things than between you and your colleagues. That being said, there are plenty of things that are westernized, but the basic human needs of I want to feel safe, I want to provide for myself and my family, I want to be respected, I want to be valued. It doesn't matter where you come from, whether you are, in a village somewhere far away or whether you live in New York and urban cities, those will always be your basic needs. And that's why we, once again emphasize that when we talk about psychological safety, even though we overcomplicate it, it's a basic human need. So let's not overcomplicate and forget that. And I want to pick up just one last question that Gabriella is asking, and I'll ask for you to provide one interesting example because I think it's a beautiful way of how to conclude this conversation. Gabriella is asking, what is a top behavior or probably an activity that a team can start establishing, be it online or in face-to-face meetings, to create this sense of inclusion? While you're thinking, maybe I'll add one example of how and hopefully I understand the question correctly. And Gabriella, correct us if we didn't get it right. But for instance, to cultivate sense of inclusion and sense of psychological safety, there's a beautiful example that I picked out from Brene Brown's work. And it is basically at the beginning of the session, be it virtual, be it in a physical space, writing down, giving everyone, 30 seconds to write down on a sticky note and piece of paper, what do they allow themselves to do in this session? And then everyone around the table shares. And you only spend about 5 minutes of that. But what it allows is for everyone to say, actually, today I feel low on energy and I permit and allow myself to be present, but refrain from asking questions. Or actually, on the other hand, I might be an introvert and I might not have spoken up in these conversations, but today I allow myself to ask the questions that I need to ask. And that creates, that environment where we start understanding where that person might be today in this point of time, and respecting that and giving that person either the space to talk or the space to simply be present and not talk. It's just a simple example, but it allows everyone to just start the conversation without going straight into business, but really checking in, where are we and what we allow and permit ourselves to do in this session.
For me, it's a very general question, and I always stay away from general questions. My answer is depends. I will have 50 questions back. I need to understand what type of behavior, what type of team, what type of inclusivity. I always stay away from general questions because I don't have one key for all the doors, and I need to first understand what the situation is or what the example is for me to put some skin on the bone, so to say. Another reason why I always stay away from general questions is because my fear is always that I give 3 simple examples and that person thinks, oh, now I know, I don't need to hire someone externally. I can just do it myself. And I think that is wrong. So as a result, when I don't understand the question or I think that is too general, I would say, please contact me, get in touch. We would like to understand, and maybe we can give you a solution rather than ideas. But that's just me.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the key here is just being mindful that you have very likely have a diversity of people that are part of that team, diversity in terms of, backgrounds, experiences, the kind of identities that they bring into that environment. So I would say prior to the meeting, do your homework, right? To get as best of an understanding as possible in terms of who is going to be in the meeting, right? And given what those dynamics might be, do your research in terms of what can you learn about some of those cultural differences and cultural values of those who are part of the meeting. Don't use it to negatively profile people, but use it to inform how you might adjust your leadership style, right? Your inclusive leadership style in terms of how you facilitate that experience. So do as much homework as you can to understand who's going to be in the room, what the different cultural dynamics might be represented there, and use that to inform how you engage. And then I would say once you actually are in the meeting and let's say you are facilitating, again, always find multiple ways to get feedback from people, because don't assume that everybody's going to feel comfortable speaking up verbally. Others might feel better, more comfortable writing a note or putting something in the chat box, but provide a diversity of options for the group so that you understand and meet the needs of the different personalities, different cultural identities that may be represented in that group. So just some basic things that I think you can do at least to give yourself a jump start on creating that inclusive environment.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you both for staying a little bit longer. Thank you everyone who has stayed with us a little bit longer. I can see still, double digits here with us. So it's, great to see just how interested and curious people are about this topic, and the insightful and very well thought through questions that have been asked here today really show that. And who knows, maybe we will come back again for a round 2 of psychological safety conversation. I know that people are busy right now during the summer, be it relaxing or attending every conference under the sun, but I think this is not a one-off conversation where we can cover everything. Again, it's evolving. We can go deeper. We can, provide more practical examples. So I would definitely be interested in picking this up a little bit later as well. But once again, thank you for everyone who's been on this session with us throughout the session. Those who might be watching it on replay, I think we have shared a lot of fundamentals about what psychological safety is, why is it important, and some real concrete examples of how you can cultivate psychological safety within your environment. So don't make this a one-off conversation. Keep on talking about it, but even more importantly, keep on practicing it, because once again, this work does not require 12 months. There is time and place for strategy, but this does not require 12-month or 18-month strategies. It does not require, high up approvals and those kinds of things. A lot of this is behavioral, and it doesn't sometimes even require investment apart from time, willingness, and commitment. So thank you so much for everyone being here. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Bogdan, for finding time and being as part of this conversation in this format. I enjoyed it just as much as last conversation. I think between the 2 sessions, we have covered a lot of ground and given people a lot of thought-provoking material. Yet I feel, simple enough for anyone to grasp, regardless of their seniority level or title within an organization. So thank you so much. Welcome to summer. And I look forward to picking up the sort of part 2 of this conversation, perhaps sometime later down the line, because it looks like people are enjoying all the amazing things and nuggets that you are sharing within this conversation. Thank you both. And thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend and month.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.